Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, February 2nd edition of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And just in case anyone's interested, it's not only Groundhog Day, but it's James Joyce's birthday. Anyhow, here's an article called Will the Spirit of 1976 Come to 2076? This is by Stephen Kurtz. Garland Pollard was 11 in 1976, the year the United States celebrated its 200th birthday, and was living in Virginia Beach with his parents. "We were a Nixon family," Mr. Pollard said. "I remember all the dinner party talk about Watergate. There were race riots at that time. It was pretty feisty. There were arguments at the dinner table." Yet, as Mr. Pollard, 60, wrote in an editorial last summer in Boca Beacon, the Florida newspaper he edits, in that bicentennial year there was a wave of patriotism that came seemingly out of nowhere. This time around, as America commemorates its 250th anniversary, there will be a government-sponsored mixed martial arts bout on the White House lawn, and plenty of debate about what it means to celebrate the birth of a nation that finds itself arguably more divided than it was in 1976. Final plans for the biggest celebrations, including a nationwide block party this summer, are coming together amid protests against federal agents in U.S. cities and international unease over Trump's stated desire to take control of Greenland. In short, are Americans in the mood to celebrate the semi-quincentennial? Said Rosie Rios, the chair of the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, a nonpartisan group charged by Congress to plan festivities under the banner America 250. "In the back of my mind, that question does come up. Are we ready?" The bicentennial year was not always sunny. Trust in the federal government was at a low 2 years after President Richard Nixon's resignation. The Vietnam War had come to an end, but scars remained. The economy was so dire that a new word was coined to describe it: stagflation. In April, a desegregation protest in Boston turned into a riot, during which a photojournalist captured a white man appearing to attack a black man with an American flag. The photo, titled "The Soiling of Old Glory," won a Pulitzer Prize. Mark Stein, a professor of history at San Francisco State University and the author of the forthcoming book Bicentennial, A Revolutionary History of the 1970s, said he had been struck by the eerie parallels between 1976 and 2026. "In both cases, the celebration takes place in the aftermath of impeachment proceedings," Mr. Stein said. "In both cases, there's international conflict. Perception of an urban crisis is another parallel. Celebration and protest came together in an anti-big business demonstration held by the People's Bicentennial at the Washington Monument on July 4, 1976, with participants dressed in revolutionary costume. But for the most part, the nation's 200th anniversary gave Americans the opportunity to look on the bright side of their nation and its history. All across the country, people painted fire hydrants in stars and stripes, or to resemble Betsy Ross and other famed early Americans. Millions of spectators turned out for the tall ships that sailed from the Gulf Coast to New York and Boston harbors. Johnny Cash served as the Grand Marshal of the miles-long Grand Bicentennial Parade in Washington, with President Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth looking on. As part of a school field trip, Ms. Rios, 60, traveled from her home in Hayward, California, to Oakland to see a traveling exhibition, the Freedom Train, a steam-powered locomotive pulling cars loaded with American artifacts. As a 14-year-old in New Jersey, Ronald Rinaldi played a Continental Army soldier in a reenactment of George Washington's crossing of the Delaware. "There were thousands of people in attendance," Mr. Rinaldi, 63, recalled. "The organizers had these bicentennial envelopes they stamped that we carried across the river." That moment set Mr. Rinaldi on his life's path. He majored in American history in college, adopted the Founding Fathers as personal heroes, and became a historical reenactor. It was a time to be happy about your country, he said the bicentennial year, to be proud of your country. In an act of patriotic cosplay, hundreds of men, women, and children crossed the country in 19th century style wagon trains as part of the bicentennial wagon train pilgrimage. The caravan set off from Blaine, Washington on June 8, 1975. Participants hewed to old pioneer trails and camped along the way. A review of musicians and actors performed at each stop. The journey ended at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, in time for the fireworks on July 4th, 1976. These people were farm people, rural people, horse people, said Earl Reinhalter, 75, one of the wagon train musicians, describing the participants. This was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. It's not happening now, 50 years later. Asked if he felt the country was gearing up for the 250th anniversary as it had for the bicentennial, Mr. Reinhalter said, "I don't see much excitement, to be honest." Part of the reason, he added, might be the mouthful term semi-quincentennial. The word you have to use doesn't roll off the tongue, he said. From a marketing standpoint, it's kind of awkward. The 300th anniversary may be more exciting. The U.S. Chief of Protocol, did you know there was a Chief of Protocol? Monica Crowley, who serves as the Trump administration's representative for major government-sponsored events, including the semi-quincentennial, acknowledged that America today is riven by very deep divisions. Ms. Crowley, 57, recalled celebrating July 4th, 1976 at the Jersey Shore. As a young girl, she felt almost a coziness about American patriotism and pride, she said. We are seeking that same kind of feeling for every kind of American. A sign of the divisions noted by Ms. Crowley is the continued promotion by Mr. Trump and many of his aides and supporters of the debunked claim that he won the 2020 election. In a social media post on Thursday, Ms. Crowley backed the president, writing, "President Trump won 2020 in a landslide." Still, she added, "I'm very optimistic about the American people and our capacity to overcome our divisions when we are united by a common goal, or in this case, a common celebration." Whenever the nation throws itself a party, the sitting president plays the host in chief. In 1976, the role fell to the unassuming President Ford, who was trying to distance himself from his pardoning of Nixon while running an election campaign. This would have been an opportunity to deliver a vision for the country, said Scott Kaufman, a history professor at Francis Marion University and the author of Ambition, Pragmatism, and Party, a political biography of the 38th president. Ford was not a good speechmaker, he said. It may have been a lost opportunity there. Trump, who revels in speech making and pageantry, has taken the matter into his own hands. Sorry about that. He is overseeing a calendar of commemorative happenings under the banner Freedom 250, which is separate from the America 250 Congressional Commission. The Freedom 250 events include the UFC fight at the White House on Flag Day, which is also the president's 80th birthday. Events on the National Mall, including a prayer gathering and an athletic competition featuring high school students dubbed the Patriot Games. One young man and one young woman from each state and territory, Mr. Trump said in a video last month that introduced the games. Then he waded into the politicized debate over transgendered athletes. But I promise there will be no men playing in women's sports. You're not going to see that. Decades before the internet provided citizens with their own information silos, the media landscape of 1976 helped ensure mass awareness and participation. Three major TV networks dominated the national discourse, helped along by daily newspapers with millions of subscribers and much-read news magazines. All went big on the patriotic theme. The long lead time didn't hurt. Planning for the bicentennial began in 1957. Corporate America backed the message with patriotic tie-ins by companies from Campbell Soup to Johnny Walker. Burger King offered what it called a colorful and fact-filled calendar, to illustrate historical events in the birth of the U.S. It came with 12 coupons worth a total of $8. Even British Airlines got in on the act with a new tagline: "You gave us the business 200 years ago, America. Here's hoping you'll do it again." The commercialization was so pervasive that by the fall of 1975, Time magazine had already labeled it overkill. That level of hype is not much in evidence today. "I don't think it's exposed as much as it should be," said Mr. Rinaldi, the director of special education at a school in Somerset, New Jersey. "I can remember hearing more about the bicentennial in school as a kid than I see we're doing now as teachers." Before he began talking about the semi-quincentennial in class, most students had absolutely no idea it was coming up, said Mr. Stein, the college professor. Mr. Rinaldi also expressed concern about protests this summer, given the heated political climate. "When July 4th comes," he said, "are there going to be rioters?" Perhaps more troubling than a fractious 250th anniversary is one that could be met with a shrug. A recent Gallup poll suggested that Americans' sense of national pride had hit a low. Each generation was less likely to identify as extremely or very patriotic, with members of Gen Z expressing the least patriotic feelings. For her part, Ms. Rios, the America 250 chair, is aiming for a big tent celebration that appeals to all Americans. That includes critics. "You can still love your country and want it to be more perfect as our founding fathers envisioned," she said. "Why wouldn't you be patriotic?" An interesting article. Judge bars further changes to George Washington's Philadelphia house. This is by Mattathias Schwartz. A federal judge in Philadelphia ordered the National Park Service not to make further changes to the president's house site, where George Washington lived as the head of the fledgling U.S. government, as she considers a lawsuit filed by the city of Philadelphia. At a day-long hearing on Friday, the city argued that the Park Service was obliged to restore plaques and videos commemorating 9 enslaved people who served Washington's household on the site. These items were removed by the Trump administration as part of a broader effort to use its control of the park system to reframe American history by eliminating materials that, quote, "inappropriately disparage Americans past or living." Judge Cynthia Roof, who was appointed by President George W. Bush to Federal District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, expressed deep skepticism about Trump's efforts on Friday. She called its purported legal basis cavalier and the prospect of further changes frightening. On Monday, according to the case docket, she inspected the removed displays which the government has said are being held in storage at the National Constitution Center. Judge Roof's Monday order stops short of mandating that the displays be put back up, as the city requested. Instead, it orders no further removal and or destruction of the site until further order of the court. That would appear to cover other parts of the memorial that include mentions of slavery and civil rights, including a stone wall with the names of 9 enslaved people who served Washington's household, and an open-air structure displaying quotes from Maya Angelou and Frederick Douglass. The clash over the site is happening against a backdrop of preparations for the country's 250th birthday celebration in Philadelphia and growing tensions in the city over Trump's immigration crackdown. Some local officials have raised the possibility of Philadelphia law enforcement arresting officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Border Patrol. Last week, Larry Krasner, the city's district attorney, said he would find federal agents who had broken the law the way they hunted down Nazis for decades. The case before Judge Roof turns on whether the Interior Department, which includes the Park Service, was obliged to consult with the city before removing the slavery-related materials. Those kinds of consultations took place when Independence National Historical Park was first created, and during years of planning for the slavery memorial at the president's house leading up to its 2010 dedication. The city argues that while the site is Park Service property, some portions of a decades-long series of agreements between the federal government and the city governing its operation remain in force. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Justice Department lawyers have argued that the city is trying to infringe on the federal government's right to free speech in deciding how the history of the site should be described. They also argue that the case should be transferred to a different court, the Court of Federal Claims, under an 1887 law that gives the court jurisdiction over contract disputes with the federal government. According to internal Park Service documents reviewed by the New York Times, the administration has ordered more changes to other parts of Independence National Historical Park, including alterations to displays at the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall that address slavery and the broader struggle for civil rights by Black people. As Judge Roof's order is limited to the president's house, it does not appear to block those changes from moving forward. Here's another article. Trump, in an escalation, calls for Republicans to, quote, nationalize elections, by Reed Epstein and Nick Corasaniti. President Trump called in a new interview for the Republican Party to, quote, nationalize voting in the United States, an aggressive rhetorical step that was likely to raise new worries about his administration's efforts to involve itself in election matters as he and his allies continue to make false claims about his 2020 defeat. During an extended monologue about immigration on a podcast released on Monday by Dan Bongino, his former deputy FBI director, Trump called for Republican officials to take over voting procedures in 15 states, though he did not name them. The Republicans should say, we want to take over, he said. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. Under the Constitution, American elections are governed primarily by state law, leading to a decentralized process in which voting is administered by county and municipal officials in thousands of precincts across the country. Trump, however, has long been fixated on the false claim that the U.S. elections are rife with fraud and that Democrats are perpetrating a vast conspiracy to have undocumented immigrants vote and lift the party's turnout. Trump's remarkable call for a political party to seize the mechanisms of voting follows a string of moves from his administration to try to exert more control over American elections. Last week, FBI agents seized ballots and other voting records from the 2020 election from an election center in Fulton County, Georgia, where his allies have for years pursued false claims of election fraud. The New York Times reported on Monday that Trump had spoken on the phone to the FBI agents involved in the Fulton County raid, praising and thanking them. The Justice Department, which has been newly politicized under Trump, is demanding that numerous states, including Minnesota, turn over their full voter rolls as the Trump administration tries to build a national voter file. In March, Trump signed an executive order that tried to make significant changes to the electoral process, including requiring documentary proof of citizenship and demanding that all mail ballots be received by the time polls close on Election Day. But that effort has largely been rebuffed by the courts. On social media, Trump has pushed for even more drastic changes. In August, he wrote that he wanted to end the use of mail-in ballots and potentially the use of voting machines. The president's claims of election fraud have been debunked over and over by both independent reviews and Republican officials. A review of the 2024 election by the Trump administration that began last year had found little evidence of widespread voting fraud by non-citizens as of last month. Trump's escalated remarks about elections come at a moment when Democrats have outperformed the GOP in a series of contests. New Jersey and Virginia elected Democratic governors in landslides in November. And on Saturday, a Democrat won a special election for a Texas state Senate seat by 14 percentage points in a district that Trump had carried by 17 points in 2024, an enormous swing. Sensing that Republicans were vulnerable to the traditional midterm backlash against the party in power, Trump last year kickstarted an extraordinary effort to gerrymander congressional maps to give his party an edge. The push, which started in Texas but has since expanded to both Democratic and Republican controlled states, became a central part of the president's midterm strategy. Trump has made little secret of his interest in expanding the federal government's role in administering American elections. Last month, he told The Times that he regretted not dispatching the National Guard to seize voting machinery after the 2020 election. During his interview with Mr. Bongino, Trump tied his desire for partisan control of voting mechanisms to his administration's agenda to find and deport undocumented immigrants from American cities. If Republicans don't get them out, you will never win another election as a Republican, he said, referring to undocumented immigrants. It's crazy how you can get these people to vote. If we don't get them out, look, Republicans will never win another election. There is no evidence that a significant number of non-citizens have voted in any American election. A 2024 audit by Georgia's Secretary of State found that just 20 of the 8.2 million people registered to vote in Georgia were not citizens, and only 9 had ever voted. And here's an editorial, an opinion piece from Thomas Friedman. The message from Texas voters: we are neighbors, not enemies. One of the biggest political lessons I learned covering the Middle East for 4+ decades is that there's only one good thing about extremists: they don't know when to stop. As a result, they eventually go too far and drive themselves over a cliff. That lesson came to my mind when I was reading about how a Texas Democrat, Taylor Remmett, trounced his Republican opponent in a state legislative special election on Saturday, prevailing in a historically conservative district around Fort Worth, which Trump won by more than 17 percentage points in 2024. What struck me most was this paragraph in the Times story by our Texas bureau chief, J. David Goodman, about the result. Remmett, a machinist at a Lockheed Martin fighter jet plant in Fort Worth, said in an interview with the New York Times during the campaign that he didn't like party labels and believed that voters were really tired of the partisanship. He made his support for public education, including vocational programs, central to his campaign. I think those 10 words, really tired of the partisanship, and his support for public education, are some of the most important words in American politics today. I think many Americans are growing both exhausted and frightened by Trump's scorched earth, hyper-partisan, fire-ready aim approach to the presidency, in which he's been treating Democrats not as political opponents, but as traitors, wiping out Democrats from previously bipartisan boards, slapping his name on the Kennedy Center ahead of JFK's, and lately even accusing President Barack Obama of treason, to name just a few of his inflammatory, divisive actions. I think a lot of Americans are tired of being pitted against their neighbors and hunger to be brought together for a common purpose. They want common sense solutions and to preserve our most cherished public institutions. As the Times reported from Texas, Remmett defeated the Trump-endorsed Lee Wamsgans, a longtime conservative activist who had helped propel a social conservative takeover of several school boards in and around the district in 2022. Last year, Goodman wrote, more moderate candidates ousted many social conservatives from the boards, suggesting an emerging backlash. Wamsgans and her conservative compatriots focused on banning books about race, gender fluidity, and LGBTQ issues. But this Texas election outcome did not surprise me. a personal story. In October 2024, my lecture agent sent me a speaking offer from Pittsburgh State University. As I live outside Washington, D.C., I knew I'd be able to get there easily if I got in a news crush, which is what happened. The week before the scheduled lecture the next spring, I had to go to Korea, and I returned just 2 days before the engagement. No problem, I thought. I can just hop over to Pittsburgh and maybe get back the same night. But when I called my agent for my travel logistics, he quickly explained, no, it's Pittsburgh without an H. Where is Pittsburgh without an H, I asked. It's in southern Kansas, he said. You've got to be kidding, I responded. How do I get there? The fastest way, he said, was to fly to Chicago at 7 a.m. and then fly from there to Springfield, Missouri, and then drive an hour and a half to the Pittsburgh State campus in Crawford County in southeastern Kansas. Oh my, I thought, did I get this wrong? Anyway, I made the trek. When I got there, I participated in a roundtable with students, an interview with campus and local journalists, and a dinner with donors and faculty members. And then I gave a talk, an examination of American life. The students were great, hungry to learn, and the audience, Trump won the county 62% to 37%, could not have been more welcoming. After I finished my formal lecture, I was interviewed on stage by Professor Chris Childers, the Dean of the university's College of Arts and Sciences. During the Q&A with Childers, he asked me a question. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I do remember my answer and the audience's reaction. My answer was, to the best of my recollection, President Trump says his favorite word is tariffs. My favorite word is public. Public schools, public service, public parks, public universities, public libraries, public health, public transportation, public places. Of all the things that I said that night, that line got the loudest applause. By the end of the day, I was exhausted and jet lagged, but I was so glad that I had come to Pittsburgh without an H. And that's why I was not at all surprised at what happened in that special election in Fort Worth. I believe the most underappreciated political aspiration in America today is the hunger of many Americans, not all, but many, to be pulled together and not pulled apart. I still believe that many Americans want to strengthen the public institutions and shared common interests that bind us, not to rename them all Trump. They want to see one another as neighbors again, not the enemy next door. But, attention, progressive Democrats in the universities they dominate need to heed that message too. They have not been blameless in generating our divides. As the Brown University economist Glenn Loury wisely observed in a recent essay, for years identity politics was treated, rightly, as a pathology of the left. It displaced the individual as the bearer of moral and political claims and instead proposed group membership defined by race, gender, and sexuality as the proper grounds for justice. Well, guess what happened? Loury added. The right's response to progressive identity politics has not chiefly taken the form of repudiation. It has taken the form of adoption. What we are witnessing is not merely a backlash, it's a convergence. We no longer debate whether identity should be the battlefield, said Loury. Only which identities deserve protection or priority: white, black, brown, gay, straight, trans, Native American. We never talk about how our shared citizenship could survive our grievances and differences. This is our collective race to the bottom. It is our collective race away from our national project of making out of many one and into a zero-sum national brawl over whose country is this anyway. And it is taking our great nation over a cliff. I am convinced that many Americans of all races, creeds, and colors want it stopped before it really does tip into civil war. You know where I go for relief? Ever since I covered the Marines in Beirut in 1982, whenever I've gotten depressed about America's fate and future, I try to take a trip with the U.S. military. It's an incredibly diverse organization, but everyone answers to and embraces just one identity: American. Just one identity: American. There is some secret sauce there that needs to be shared with the rest of the country. I know where it starts. Whatever policies Democrats and Republicans choose to run on in the midterms, affordability, lower taxes, abundance or free buses, both parties would do the country a huge favor if they adopted the last words that Renee Good said to the ICE agents before one of them shot and killed the Minneapolis mom as she hastily tried to leave a protest scene. I'm not mad at you. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And here's an essay by Frank Bruni called Hey Republicans, Trump is the President. Given Trump's habitual insistence that he's a victim of partisan prosecutors, incompetent pollsters, the Federal Reserve, Norway, it's a tribute to him that Republicans are identifying yet another clique of malefactors doing him wrong. He's been undermined by his own accomplices. They're doling out bad advice. That was the precise phrase, the exact verdict, rendered by Governor Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma in an interview on CNN about the killing of Alex Pretty and the brutality of ICE agents in Minneapolis. Stitt acknowledged deep concerns over federal tactics and accountability, but he also insisted that the president's priorities regarding immigration and border security were right. It's just that Trump was getting bad advice right now. Other Republicans delivered the same message by focusing intently on the sins of Kristi Noem, the nation's Homeland Security Secretary, and the callousness of Gregory Bovino, the senior Border Patrol official who egged on the government's masked gunman until he was given a timeout last week. They botched the mission, debased the president. What a joke. You can't dishonor someone who has no honor to begin with. You can't humiliate someone who so consistently and thoroughly humiliates himself. But that's just the start of the bad advice bunk. Bad advice is a plausible excuse only if the person you're trying to excuse had little to no part in picking his advisors or had reasons to believe they weren't who they turned out to be. In Trump's case, the opposite is true. He ended up with such a wretched crew of cabinet secretaries and senior administration officials because a wretched crew is what he was after. That way, he'd have underlings who owed their lofty titles and fancy perks entirely to him. Sycophants who wouldn't try to saddle him with scruples or tether him to sense, not so much a counsel for counsel as a font of praise. During Trump's first administration, he had minders. For his second, he wanted a pep squad. Its members exist not to make him smarter, but to validate his grievances and mirror his mood. Nick Cataggio put it well in a recent article in the Dispatch, explaining why Stephen Miller, who so quickly and falsely slandered both Pretty and Renee Good, won't be purged in Trump's attempts to move on from the Minneapolis mess. He's less an advisor than a spirit animal for the president, a sort of human operating system for Trumpism. Cataggio wrote, firing him would amount to uninstalling the post-liberal ideological software on which the entire administration runs. Bad advice implies that Trump isn't calling the shots, but Trump is constantly telling us otherwise. He can't be vulnerable to bad advice if he needs no advice in the first place. Take it from him. He's omniscient, omnipotent. Behold him as he summarily imposes tariffs, hastily erases them, orders the bombing of Iranian bunkers, directs the sinking of Venezuelan boats, deposes one autocrat, pardons another, deploys federal troops, ends, or at least claims to end, foreign wars. He's a presidential superhero, the likes of which America has never seen. How do you fit bad advice into that fable? Bad advice inadvertently and hilariously turns Trump into his caricature of former President Joe Biden. Trump's favorite knock on Biden is that he was a hollow figurehead, a marionette without the presence of mind or energy of finger to sign his own name. But bad advice implies a similar enfeeblement. It gives Trump an autopen of his very own. But above all, it demonstrates Republicans' keen awareness of his insecurities and their fear of offending him and being punished for that. If they direct their qualms and complaints at those lesser mortals beneath and beside him, maybe they'll avoid his wrath. And maybe that's the best way, the only way to get him to change. No, there is no flaw in you, your majesty. It's that awful infernal advice. When the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, recently questioned Trump's proposal for a 10% cap on credit card interest rates, he was careful to speculate that the president may be getting advice on some of these issues and to imply that the advice was bad. Even Senator Thom Tillis, a North Carolina Republican who has been increasingly critical of the Trump administration since he decided not to seek re-election this year, lets the president at least partly off the hook. Discussing Trump's recent threats about seizing control of Greenland, he told NBC News the president has been given bad advice, and whoever gave him bad advice should probably not be in that role. I'm all for different deckhands, but they won't right or rescue this ship. Trump built it. He set it on its course, with all the ugly words that he has spoken about so many Americans, all the steps that he has taken to sideline and silence anyone who countermands him, all the bullying and cruelty he has modeled, all the criminality he has sanctioned. Pretty and good aren't dead because of bad advice. They're dead because of bad men acting out the script that a bad president wrote for them. And here's an essay by David French. It's called, "This is Not a Drill." It's only February, and the November elections are already in peril. When I think back to the days and weeks before January 6, 2021, one thing that's clear is that many of us suffered from a failure of imagination. We knew Trump's lies and conspiracy mongering were dangerous, but it's hard to think of a single person who predicted that a MAGA mob would storm the Capitol. Very few people anticipated the sheer scale and scope of the effort to overturn the election, or that an incredible 147 Republicans would vote not to certify Joe Biden's clear and unambiguous presidential victory. We did not realize that they would go along with something that plainly corrupt and dangerous. We must not make that mistake again. And so I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to ask you to imagine alongside me. But this is a different kind of imagination. It's based on real events, things that are already occurring right in front of our eyes. So here we go. It's Friday, October 30th, 2026, and the president's approval rating is low, abysmally low. He hasn't been able to reverse the gradual decline that began after his inauguration. At the end of January, his aggregate approval rating was 41.4%, and his disapproval rating was 55.7%. In June, his approval dropped below 40%, and it hasn't come back up since. Meanwhile, Democrats are leading the generic ballot by a wide margin, and Democratic voters are far more enthusiastic about going to the polls than Republicans. In a normal midterm election, this would mean that Democrats would easily take control of the House of Representatives. They could even win the Senate. But this is not a normal election year. Now in October, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which rapidly expanded throughout the year, is running large-scale operations in Democratic-controlled cities. Hundreds, if not thousands, more American citizens have been caught in the dragnet. So have thousands of lawful residents. Citizens, lawful residents, and undocumented immigrants alike have been shackled and transported to brutal detention facilities in Texas and Florida. Despite repeated court orders holding that federal officials cannot stop, much less detain anyone purely on the basis of perceived ethnicity, the stops are still happening on a daily basis in cities across the United States. Not only has the administration defied hundreds of court orders, it also refuses to discipline rogue officers. A complex web of federal immunities and privileges further insulates these officers from both private lawsuits and state prosecutions. As a result, non-white citizens are reluctant to go anywhere near ICE, and rumors of ICE conducting operations near polling stations spread like wildfire. Thousands upon thousands of citizens choose to stay home rather than risk arrest to vote. During early voting, reports of citizens discovering they're no longer on the voting rolls have multiplied. Most of them have Latin, African, or Asian sounding names. The voters named Smith or Jones have had no problem, but if you're a Gonzalez or a Diallo, then you've been purged. Meanwhile, the FBI has raided several election offices in blue cities in swing states. Lawmakers in red states have moved to take over election administration in certain blue cities, citing the president's raids and indictments as justifications. At the same time, his base has continued to radicalize. Democratic protests against the ICE deployments are viewed in these quarters as proof that Democrats want undocumented immigrants to vote, that they can't win without them. The president himself stokes their anxiety and their anger. His social media feeds are full of the wildest accusations, constantly repeating even the most specious conspiracy theories about the 2016 and 2020 elections. He keeps up his calls to arrest former President Barack Obama. He also calls for the arrest of Democratic governors and lawmakers. He tells his base, the people who trust him more than any news source, that the Democratic Party is a criminal enterprise and that its members will destroy the country if they win the midterms. Right-wing media are full of mugshots of heavily tattooed, scowling criminals that ICE has allegedly yanked from the streets. Their banner on the television underneath their mugshots reads, Democrat voters. President Trump's raids and indictments proved to them that they were right all along. The 2020 election was corrupt. And when federal judges issued injunctions requiring federal law enforcement to stay away from polling places, that's all the proof they need to raise the alarm. The election is rigged, they shout. And they're right, just not in the way they think. The horrifying thing about our current moment is that not a single aspect of the scenario above is far-fetched. In fact, some of it is already happening. Not only did the FBI raid a Georgia election center last week, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, was present. She's a cabinet-level official responsible for coordinating the activities of American intelligence agencies, yet there she was, in Fulton County, Georgia. The Wall Street Journal reports that Gabbard has turned much of her attention to investigating the 2020 election, an election that withstood dozens of legal challenges. According to the Journal, she's investigating possible foreign interference. The search warrant itself contains a claim that there is probable cause to believe that there is property, data, or information at the Fulton County Election Office that is evidence of the commission of a criminal offense. In the days after the search, 2 Republican-appointed members of the state election board said that it was on the radar as an avenue we could take to seize control of elections in Fulton County. 90% of Atlanta lies within the county. Federal agents are seizing American citizens. There is an enormous amount of evidence that they are racially profiling their suspects and mistreating their detainees. Even if federal agents don't show up at polling places, the presence of armed federal agents at the polls is prohibited by federal criminal law. They raise the risk of travel even for American citizens who might look Hispanic by blanketing majority Hispanic parts of a given city. But criminal law is no impediment to Trump. He'll just pardon the violent men and women who break federal law to keep him in power. And if federal courts enjoin ICE activities, would anyone trust Trump to comply? As the Republican-appointed chief judge for the Federal District Court of Minnesota wrote last week, ICE has likely violated more court orders in January 2026 than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, sent Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota a letter promising to bring an end to the chaos in his state if he agreed to a list of demands, including granting Justice Department officials access to its voter rolls. After the FBI raided the Fulton County Election Center, Trump demanded Obama's arrest on social media and threatened the prosecution of election workers. He claimed, among other things, that Italian military satellites had hacked the 2020 election and that Obama had conspired with foreign powers, not one, not two, not three, but 4 times, to overthrow the United States government in 2016. The Italian satellite theory is a jolting reminder that Trump will demand that his core supporters believe almost anything he says, no matter how wild or delusional. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As Jonathan Karl reported for ABC News, this theory was brought to the White House by a woman who went by several aliases, including the Heiress, and was known at the Pentagon for her claimed ties to Somali pirates. Rather than discarding the theory as obvious nonsense from an unreliable narrator, Karl Rove says that then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows directed both the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense to look into the matter. Informed readers will know that this column is woefully incomplete. I can't possibly compile all of Trump's threats against American elections into a single column. Entire books have been written describing his plot to disrupt the 2020 election. But one thing is quite clear. He is more dangerous now than he was then. His party controls the House and the Senate. In 2020, Democrats controlled the House. Trump has filled his administration with cronies and true believers, and his attorney general is one of his chief enforcers. In 2020, Bill Barr, who was then the attorney general, resigned rather than continue to pursue Trump's stolen election claims. This time around, by contrast, Ed Martin, a Justice Department official, posted a picture of himself standing next to Sidney Powell, one of the chief legal architects of Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. In 2023, she pleaded guilty to 6 counts of conspiracy to commit intentional interference with performance of election duties. The president pardoned her in November. And what was Martin's message? Good morning, America. How are you? During his first term, the Trump administration largely complied with federal court orders. In his second term, his administration is defying the courts at a frequency that boggles the mind. So even if Trump-appointed judges and justices repeat their courageous performance from 2020 and block any effort by the president to overturn the next election, it's an open question whether the Trump administration will care. A president who doesn't care about the law, who commands an obedient Congress and is supported by a radicalized base of tens of millions of people who believe his lies, represents a threat to the next election. I fear that millions of citizens are still too complacent. They aren't aware of the perils we face. And as you take note of each of the incidents I mentioned, you may realize that Trump can unlawfully influence an election without explicitly rigging the count. By deterring his enemies from coming to the polls, he can engineer the outcome he seeks. In a future column, I'll try to describe what can be done to stop him, aside from simply hoping and praying that his lawlessness has limits other than his own morality. But a nation won't rouse itself if it doesn't hear the alarm. So consider this to be something like a fire drill. It's an alarm, one of thousands that should be ringing across the country. MAGA's acts of aggression are already intimidating. Trump isn't just trying to stop the steal again. Another kind of theft might already be underway. And a final article, The Real Reason Silicon Valley Won't Stand Up to Trump, by Aaron Zamost. Hours after Alex Pretty was shot and killed by federal agents in Minneapolis, Apple's chief executive, Tim Cook, joined Trump, his wife Melania, and other luminaries in the White House to attend a screening of a documentary devoted to the First Lady. Apple employees voiced anger in internal Slack channels, while other Silicon Valley tech workers publicly denounced the Trump administration's deployment of federal officers across America. Workers at Palantir erupted in internal complaints over the software company's work with immigration enforcement. At Meta, some longtime employees are considering leaving the company, saying it is now led by a MAGA-skewing chief they no longer recognize. But by and large, tech employees reacted to how their leaders addressed or failed to address what's happening in Minneapolis with exhausted apathy. At a time when companies are shedding workers by the thousands, dumping them into an increasingly shaky job market, tech employees feel mostly powerless to influence an industry whose leaders had once convinced them that they could change the world. There are many theories about Silicon Valley's swift and very conspicuous rightward turn. Tech leaders course corrected from an overly permissive era. The Trump administration demands fealty in exchange for critical regulatory favors. Trump's reelection reshaped the national climate and reoriented the values of tech leadership. Each of these explanations is convenient, but none are correct. I've worked in tech for 20 years across both big tech and venture-backed startups, and I can tell you the truth is much more mundane. Silicon Valley's chief executives have always been driven by economics, not ideology. As Michael Corleone put it, it's not personal, it's strictly business. What has happened in tech is a market correction, not a cultural one, a transfer of power from labor back to management. To attribute this change to a vibe shift among tech leaders may flatter political actors, but it's beside the point. The real danger is mistaking a change in leverage for something permanent or confusing business incentives with values. The idea of a woke corporation was always flawed. Conflating business strategy with political belief distorts not just how we understand the tech industry, but also how we interpret corporate power in American life more broadly. Here's how Silicon Valley actually works. Big tech companies and growing startups are in constant vicious competition with one another to hire and retain the best employees, especially in product and engineering roles. When these companies are in hyper-growth mode, and particularly when the job market is tight, hiring top talent can be nothing short of a matter of survival. And they are fishing in a largely progressive pond. Political donation data show tech employees are predominantly Democratic leading. The late 2010s and early 2020s were a particularly intense period in the industry's war for talent. Hiring exploded. Meta nearly doubled to 86,000 employees in 2022 from approximately 45,000 3 years earlier. Amazon added over 400,000 employees in 2020 alone. As Silicon Valley recruiting teams relentlessly poached one another's people, tech labor had infinite choices and all the leverage. So what did companies do when a generous compensation package was no longer enough to win over candidates? They instead sold a sense of belonging. Amid fierce competition, many companies realized that encouraging workers to bring their perspectives and passions to the office could increase their loyalty and their willingness to work hard. That in turn served the real financial objective: higher job acceptance rates, lower employee attrition, and faster growth. When the pandemic further supercharged hiring, tech companies started a corporate values arms race to differentiate on employee experience. LinkedIn gave workers a full paid week off to combat burnout. Pinterest increased monetary assistance for adoption and expanded fertility benefits. Even Tesla made Juneteenth a company holiday, and no one would accuse Elon Musk of being woke. Companies said, bring your whole self to work. Tech didn't embrace these policies out of moral enlightenment. It did it because replacing a top engineer could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost productivity, institutional knowledge, recruiter time, and onboarding. When attrition costs are existential, empathy becomes a strategy. Whether it's flexible work from home policies or mental health stipends, you give your people what they want or they'll go somewhere else to get it. Whole self culture wasn't part of a political movement. It was a labor market artifact where talent war conditions made employee empowerment economically rational. A new economic reality followed the height of the pandemic, evident in Silicon Valley Bank's failure. A crypto winter of plummeting currency prices and a significant slowdown in the tech sector's growth ultimately pushed companies from Amazon to Microsoft to rein in spending on hiring, and the incentive structure flipped. Because they no longer needed to compete for labor at any cost, executives exhausted by their formerly empowered employees were happy to take back the control that they'd ceded. The slowdown didn't just change how companies behaved, it exposed what had been driving their behavior all along. It's worth asking whether many tech companies' professed values were ever real. We've seen leaders who built their reputations on defying authority become foot soldiers for the administration. The same elasticity informs their rollback of the culture they once championed. Of course, work is not the best place for cubicle fights about the war in Gaza, nor is it a place where lavish perks are entitlements. These companies are businesses, not nonprofits, but when companies said be your authentic self and then silenced employees who raised societal concerns related to their work, they essentially blamed workers for a culture war they didn't start and disciplined them for holding leaders to the values they had promised. This about face will prove counterproductive over the long term. In my conversations with tech employees, the result hasn't been anger at hypocrisy so much as detachment, a loss of tribal loyalty, and a clear understanding of the limits of corporate idealism. The recent reassertion of managerial prerogative was only possible in an economic environment where top executives could flex their muscles like a boss. It won't last forever. When labor is scarce again, many of these companies will rediscover the values they abandoned. The question is whether employees will forget just as quickly. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, February 2nd New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you next week.